Hi AP Psych friends, welcome to what is going to be your final video for Unit 4 on sensation and perception. So we're going to talk about perceptual interpretation. This is going to be a nice short and sweet one. Yay! So let's take a look here. We can talk about perceptual interpretation, right? How people understand the world around them. And there's just a couple of key terms that we haven't quite covered in the nitty-gritty on sensation and perception. First is sensory deprivation, right? Obviously, if you're born without a sense, such as sight, you can get things back with modern technology, perhaps, a corneal transplant or a cochlear implant if hearing was something that you weren't born with. But know that there are still going to, be some things that you could still sense, but you're going to have to learn some things. And so sensory deprivation, even though we've learned about the brain's plasticity and we have modern science that can help overcome some physical shortfalls, know that it's not always going to have the same effect, in that you've kind of missed a critical period for the development of those cortices in the brain, and so it makes it a lot harder to interpret. So physically sensing things may not always mean, especially if the person's been deprived of that sense for a long time, it may not always mean that they'll be able to interpret it as they should. Right. On the flip side, a positive note here is that we have an amazing ability to adapt to changes in senses. And so if you have, good senses, but perhaps end up, having a distortion of vision due to an injury, or loss of hearing due to old age or damage to the inner ear, people still have an amazing ability to adapt. Also related to our interpretation of sensory information are what are known as perceptual sets, and we'll look at some examples of these in class. But please know that our experiences, our assumptions, our expectations are all going to affect how we interpret the world around us. And so the interesting thing is, and I guess that this gets more philosophical on you, is that once we perceive the wrong idea of a reality, it's really hard to reverse the effects. And also know that, once you have an idea set in your mind, that schema, whether that be a right or wrong interpretation of an idea or of reality, that could affect future interpretations of sensory stimuli. Think about the Loftus and Palmer experiments that you read about in 40 Studies, and the inaccuracy of eyewitness testimony as just one small example of how perceptual sets can impact our interpretation of the world. Some related ideas: context, right? That remember that our brain is always using that top-down processing to interpret the world around us. And so think about, like, if you're watching a movie, like the soundtrack of a movie can be impacting how you feel about what's going on the screen, or the dialogue that is being said. The sad music can make you... Wow, that was a Freudian slip there. Yeah, sad music can affect you interpreting the words as being sad. Culture can influence how something is interpreted, and so we'll look at some examples in class of how you were raised and what cultural context can actually affect your interpretation of optical illusions. And we obviously know that emotion and motivation can play a role, right? It's harder to concentrate on things when you're tired or when you're sick. When you're unhappy in a relationship, you tend to start, only seeing the bad things rather than looking at the picture overall, right? Some of that confirmation bias can play a role in our perception of the world around us. Okay, and then the last thing to mention in Unit 4 is the concept of ESP, or extrasensory perception. Look, this all sounds super fun, but understand that this belongs to a field known as parapsychology. So these things like telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, aren't accurate and that we can't give any scientific conclusive evidence of their actual existence, right? Given the billions of events in a day and the number of times that we think about stuff, there's a pretty good chance that some coincidences are going to happen, right? And so it's really, perhaps not some sort of premonition, but more of that confirmation bias at work. All right, and until ESP is put to the true experimental test with controlled experiments using reliable, ethical, valid, scientific data, we're just not going to consider ESP a study in legitimate psych. All right, so bring any questions that you have about the conclusion of Unit 4 with you to class, and we'll discuss it then. Lots more examples to come too. Thanks for listening.